The fundamental part of an XML system is the XML instance. And I've said before that the XML instance is the content file. It's the file that has all the information in it. You'll also hear me use this word info base. I like using that word because it really tells me a lot about what this thing does. It's like a database of all of our information. So it may look like HTML, but in fact what it really is like a database where all of our information is neatly organized and named with just the names that we've chosen to best describe it. So let's go into a little bit more about this instance. When you see files on your computer folders, you'll see some are .xml. If they're .xml files, that means that they're instances. I'll use this word instance because that's the proper word for it. I said before that it's an instance of the schema. Don't worry if you don't really understand that just yet. It's an instance, it's the content file, it contains all the information. It's very analogous to the HTML file, except it goes far beyond and it behaves as a database as well. Okay, so let's take a look at an instance. I have on the screen here a little piece of something that we're going to work with later in the course. And this instance has a photo tag. Let's see, what does it have? Sorry, it has a set of tags in it. And you'll see, if you squint your eyes, you can almost imagine that you're looking at HTML. Right? So you squint your eyes and you don't really read the tags and you see the brackets and the quotes and all that kind of stuff, and it seems a lot like HTML. It has tags and tags inside of tags. Those tags have attributes. The attributes have values. As I've said before, you're not able to do messy things like leaving a quote off or leaving an end tag off. But other than that, it really has a structure at first glance a lot like HTML, except that the names are all made up. They're not HTML names. This thing is called a photo base. That's the top level tag, the tag at the very top. And a photo base has system information. You can see it says 15 lines there. That means that I've collapsed down that system information tag, and there's lots more in it. I've just collapsed it down so that you can see more what's going on. The photo base also has photos in it. It also has abouts in it, whatever those are. It also has a site hierarchy and photo subjects in it. These are all different tags that we've made up because they adequately describe our information. And as you'll see as we go forward, our information is all going to be about photography in this class as a sample application. So this is all information that we've made up. It's all about photography, but basically it looks a lot like HTML, only with made up names. So I said that this contains your base of information. I said that this instance file is like a database. That's all old news. It's guided by strict rules. I can't just do anything I want with the information in there. I have to follow the strict rules that I've encoded in my schema. It can be edited directly inside of a text editor. We won't use a text editor. We'll use an integrated design environment. But I wanted to show you also that you can also edit XML in a very user-friendly way. So the picture you see in the lower left corner of the screen now is an editor called XML that a lot of organizations use to hide the complexity and give a WYSIWYG view of an XML document to end users who are supposed to author in it. So that's your first look at an instance. Let's now move out of the slidage and into a demo of Oxygen, where I'll go through some more of what we want to say about instances. I've listed on the screen here the location of the sample file that I'll be going through. Don't worry. Oh, I see that the L has wrapped around, so it's XML, sitefinal.xml in the course materials / sample code folder. So if you download the sample code for today, you should be able to find this. If you download it later, you'll still be able to find it. You'll see as we go through that all of the demos concern one or more files that are downloadable. And you'll be able to download during the live course all of this and follow along, but it's really not necessary for you to do that. As I said before, you can either download now and follow along with me and try to keep up with me, or you can just focus on seeing what I do now and download later and play later. Okay, so let's dip out of here and dip into Oxygen. This is a tool that we're going to be using consistently throughout the class. And you can see that I have something similar to what I just showed you on the screen here. It's photo based and it has photos. I've changed a little bit of the wording here, and I've changed it actually to be more easily comprehensible by you as you work through the course. So this is our photo base. It has all the information about all the photography that we're going to be working with in the course. We'll go through it piece by piece, and you'll see every detail about it. Right now, I just want to use it as an example of an instance. But you can see as I go through the names that they're names that make a little bit of sense. I have system information, information about the system. I have all my photos in here. I have all my narratives in here. The narratives are kind of longer, extended paragraphs about what's going on. And then I have a set of categories that all of my photographs fit into. Okay, so I've made up these names, and they're reasonable names. And as I said, as we go through, you'll learn a lot more about the names themselves. Okay, so first thing I want to show you in Oxygen is simply how to open an instance. So I'm going to close this instance, and you'll see that it has lots of familiar things in here. I can go to File, Open, and I navigate through all of my folders. You'll see a course materials folders like you have. You'll see a sample code folder like you'll have when you download the sample code. And then inside that sample code folder, you'll see something called Site Final, and that's what we're working on. So no different than anything you've ever used before. I open it up, and here it is, an instance, right? And as I said, you can squint your eyes and make believe it's HTML, but there's some more things that I want to tell you about that now go beyond what you would know about in HTML. First of all, this thing called the root element. Every element, well, you know from HTML, the very top level of HTML file is called what? Studio audience. What's the top tag of any HTML file? HTML, right? I think it was a bad name, actually. I think they should have named it page, because that's what's in there, right? HTML is like, that's what we type, but it's not HTML, it's a page. So it would make more sense at the top level of an HTML page is a tag that says page, right? And so if I was king of HTML, I'd change that word HTML to page, and I do get to be king of this tagging. So I'm going to choose a name that really describes what's going on inside this file. I'm not going to start it with the tag that says XML, because that tells me nothing. All it tells me is that there's XML in here. Well, I knew that when I opened it. What I really want to know is what's it about? What does it concern? And that's what we're going to do in all of these tag naming things that we do. It's always going to be, what's this information about? What does it concern? What kind of information is? Not what does it look like or what format did I type it in, but what is it? What is this thing? This thing is a photo base. Remember I gave you this idea that our XML files are like info bases, they're like databases. They contain all of our information in a very structured way. This is my photo base. It contains all the information I need to know about all my photos. And by the way, it has information sufficient to create a very full-featured, high-functioning website. Okay, but right now we're looking at it more like the info base, our highly structured, very organized, very comprehensive set of information about photos. Okay, so the root element, which every XML file must have, should describe what's in it. And in this case, it's describing it. It's our photo base. Okay, and in Oxygen, I have this very nice feature of having line numbers. You'll see, by the way, and I ask myself this question all the time, why aren't HTML editors like this? Why can't HTML editors do some of the things that XML editors do? And I'll show you some of the cool things that you can do, starting with opening and closing these tags. So here I have the system information, and the system information only contains one thing called title, and we'll go through why it's there and what it does in a little while, but what I want you to see is these little expanding and contracting arrows. Expanding and contracting arrows. You've seen those lots of times on websites. When do we use expanding and contracting arrows on websites? When we have something like a table of contents, right? Or an outline or a site map or menus or something like that, right? It's because there's an outline. It's because there's and I'll use the big word here, a hierarchical structure to the page. There's some parents and children. You'll see that that's really the critical element in an XML file. That's really how XML works. That's the major thing that's going on in how it organizes information. It organizes information into parents and children. So I have this grandparent of all called photobase, and I can close it up. Then photobase has certain children. It has these 4 children. System information is pretty simple. It only has this one child. Photos, on the other hand, have lots of information, lots of children and sub-children that go further and further defining things like there's a location, and the location has all sorts of information about it. And if I go past the location, I'll find a particular photo. Here's a single photo, and the photo has lots of information. Again, don't focus right now on what the information is or what it means or anything like that. Just get the idea that the basic organizational structure, the way the XML file is put together, is into one Mondo outline. And that's how we put things together. And if you think about it, that's not an unusual way to put things together. If you create a composition, you're going into some word processor and you're typing out a composition, what do? You make an outline, right? And then into that outline, you type all your stuff. So it's a very usual way for us to organize things. In fact, you might say that it's the major way that we think of when we think of things being organized. Everything has its place, and it's all in its nice little file cabinet, inside its folder, inside its subfolder, all the way down to the individual piece of paper. We organize things that way. Or in a room. Why do we put it all in a room? Because we want to get it organized. Inside the room, we put shelves to put things further organized. On shelf number 1, we put this box. Inside this box, we put other things. Inside the box, we may put a folder. Inside the folder, we put pages. Right? Those are all examples of hierarchical organization, outlines. And XML works as an outline. And so we have the major outline. So thing number 1 is that we have the expanding and contracting. Thing number 2 is that we have this Mondo outline that has all the parents and children. We have things called containers. So this thing that's called photos, notice there's nothing inside of photos except other stuff. So I create that simply as a container, just like the box that I put on the shelf. I don't care about the box per se, but I might put a label on the box that says my photos. Right now I have a container and I can put all my photos in that container. So there are times inside of XML where we create containers simply to organize the information that's in the XML file, simply to provide a way of keeping it all straight. And so that I can do things like close up all the photos and have them go away. Okay, so I want to show you something else that I think is really cool that I really wish was in HTML. Have you ever gone to a website and you've come to the website and you open the page, you go view source or something like that, and it all looks worse than this. It all looks like it's in one long line, right? And no tags are separated from any other tags, and it's impossible to figure out where something begins and ends, right? Why does HTML have to be that way? Well, it kind of comes along with the fact that HTML is lax, right? Well, not only don't you know where one tag begins and ends, but really nobody does because you forgot to type in the end tag. And without the end tag, there's no way of knowing where everything is. In XML, that doesn't fly. You always have to close all your tags. You always have to have things strictly worked through. And because of that, you can click this little button here and focus in on this button that I'm moving my mouse to, and all the indentation magically comes back. Now, if there was one thing that I would want every HTML browser to be able to do is when I say view source, to give me this stupid little button and let me put all the indents back in the HTML because my eye needs those indents in order to figure out what's going on. Without those indents, I'm lost. By the way, browsers don't need those at all, right? They seem to be able to function perfectly well without them, but human beings, when they're looking at something, they depend on those indents to say what the outline is, to say where everything belongs. Okay, so let me give you a couple of more things. I showed you that that we have things that are similar to HTML. We have an element, we have an attribute. The attribute has a name. The attribute is followed by an equal sign, and then the attribute has a value in quotes, right? All that should be familiar. The only difference is, of course, that you have to behave, and you have to always put in the quotes, and you have to always put in the angle brackets. Now, I hammer on this so hard because for most of us, we're so used to being lax that we hardly remember ever to do this stuff. And if you start trying to not do this stuff in XML, you'll get severely messed up. And you won't be able to go any further. And so I want to keep hammering on it early in the course to get you used to this idea that you really have to behave, and behave according to the rules that you already well know, but you just might not have followed in the past. Okay, I've said that there are no set tag names. I could call that location. I could have called it place. Whatever name works for me and works for the people who I'm going to be working with. Capitalization really matters. In HTML, I could type things in uppercase, lowercase. I can mix the case. Not so in XML. In XML, if I say it's all lowercase, it's going to be all lowercase, period. Nothing else possible. And if I make this one an uppercase location, you'll see, by the way, that I get a little wavy line under here. The little wavy line, just like in a word processor, says something's wrong. Something's wrong with that. It's not supposed to be uppercase. And if in fact if I change it back to lowercase l, the little waviness goes away and I'm all okay. Okay, I'll come back to that in a second. There's a couple of rules, and there's definitely it's actually a bunch of rules about how you can name tags. The only one that I want to tell you about right now, because you can find the rest when you need them, is that they have to start with a letter. Can't start with a number. Have to start with a letter. Can't start with a period. Can't start with punctuation. Have to start with a letter. So if you start all of your tags with letters, you'll be fine. Elements nest inside of each other. This is called nesting. I called it the outline before, but you can see inside the photos tag is nested, the location tag. I think you're probably familiar with that idea of nesting from HTML. We have things nesting all the time inside of XML. Okay, and then the attributes need to be quoted. All right, so that's it. That's our simple tour of instances. We're going to come back to this instance in a little while, and I'll show you some more about it. But right now, I want to jet back to the slides and just quickly review what we just did. So this is my attempt to first do a demo and then review everything that we did in the demo so that you have a list of all the things that were covered in the demo, and I have a chance to tell it to you one more time. What we did was we figured out how to open the instance, and that's just file open, just like anywhere else. We talked about the root element, that element that contains all of the other elements in the HTML file, and the fact that it's named descriptively, not by what it is, not by what it does or what format it is. It's in, but what it is. This is a photo place. I showed you how to open and close elements. That's a very, very useful thing to know how to do. I gave you the idea of parents and children, and that the XML file is basically organized in this outline structure where we have parent and children elements. I talked about containers, those XML elements that we create for no other reason except to stay organized, like the photos container, kind of like the box on the shelf. I showed you that auto indent button, and you're really going to want to find that one because you're really going to like it and you're really going to want it. Click the auto indent, and all the indentations come back right. Of course, you can't indent if you don't have all of your tags closed correctly. So the first thing you always have to do is make sure all your tags close correctly. Once they're closed correctly, you can do that auto indent. And I also showed you this idea of the outline of the instance, that we have parent, child, 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 all the way down to the bottom. Okay, we also talked a little bit about the idea that attributes and elements work like HTML. I gave you once again, and this probably won't be the last time I give you this admonishment, to always close your tag. There are no set tag names, capitalization matters, and start your tags with a letter, not with a number. Elements can nest inside of HTML. And what I've showed you here is something really strange, which is in XML, which we'll see a number of times, elements can nest inside themselves. So notice this tag that's circled, and it has the same name as its parent. Now that may seem really strange to you. It's not something we do in XML, in HTML, that the parent and the child have the same name. It would be like putting a paragraph inside a paragraph. We do, for example, put unordered lists inside of unordered lists, but they're not directly inside them. They're inside at a couple of levels down. Okay, so that's something we'll see later. I do want to introduce you to one more thing that I forgot to mention, and that's this idea of camel case. Notice this word elements can nest. This is a convention that we're going to follow. It's not a necessary convention of XML, but it's one that I'm going to follow because I like it a lot, and it's very descriptive, and it's the way that we create names when there's more than one word in the name. Elements can nest. First name, all lowercase. Second name, initial cap. Third name, initial cap. Okay, so that's just a convention. It's called camel case, and you can kind of see the camel in there, right? This is a camel with two humps. The two capitals are humps, and so we call it camel case, and that's a convention that we'll use a lot in this course. Okay, so let me pause here and give you some resources for getting started with Oxygen. As I said, it's an integrated development environment. It gives you all the tools you're going to need to work with XML. A lot of tools that we're not going to use because they're too sophisticated for this class, but a lot of tools that we're going to depend heavily on in this class. As somebody asked earlier, and I'll reiterate again, you can use another IDE, but you'll have to translate it yourself into the words that Oxygen uses. Like, for example, I pointed to that little button that puts the indentation back in. In some other environment, I'm sure they have that button, but what it's called or where you get to it or how you invoke that command to do auto indentation, I won't be able to know because I won't know what you're using. So you can download Oxygen from this URL. It's got a free 1-month trial period. It also has academic pricing, which I believe you can get. If you ask for the academic pricing in Oxygen and they don't give it to you, copy me on an email to them, and I'll rattle their cage, and I'll convince them that this is truly an academic purchase. I've gotten many downloads from Oxygen for my students in the past, and I'm sure we'll be able to get academic pricing if they give you a hard time. And so it's only $50 or $60 US, and so I think it's well worth the price for what it does for you. However, if you got another one that you're used to and you like and you want to use, that's just fine as well. I'll demo anything that we're going to use in Oxygen, but there's so much more that you can do that we're not going to use that I'll just point you to the Oxygen site, and you can view their videos and do a lot of their demos if there's stuff about Oxygen that you want to know more about. Okay, last piece of the Oxygen puzzle here is getting to well-formed. Let me introduce this concept of well-formed. We've already talked about it a lot. I just haven't called it by its right name. When I say you have to quote your attributes and you have to close all your tags, really what I'm saying is you have to follow the basic syntactical rules of XML, which, by the way, happen to be the same basic syntactical rules of HTML. Quoting your attributes, making sure you don't break the nesting I'll explain that in a little bit, and all of the basic rules. That's called well-formed. When your XML file obeys all of those basic syntactical rules, we say it's well-formed. We'll see in a little while that that's just a baseline. That's a foundation for us. What we really want to get to is this further level of correctness, which is called valid, which requires you to have a schema. But even without a schema, we have this idea of well-formed, which means it's an XML file that behaves according to all those basic rules. So I want to give you a quick demo of how Oxygen helps you get to that well-formed stage. So I'm going to bop back out over to Oxygen, and I'm going to break some things. Okay, so I'll break some simple things first. So for example, I forget to close that tag. Notice my nice little wavy lines, right, helping me to see that there's a problem. Unfortunately, it's really easy to see that there's a problem. Sometimes the message that Oxygen gives you about what the problem is kind of obscure. But if you keep in mind the basic things that could go wrong, like I spelled something wrong, or I forgot a little bracket, or I forgot a quote, or I forgot an end tag, right? Always think of those simple things, because it's almost always one of those simple things, even if Oxygen is giving you a cryptic message. The cryptic message here says F brackets Xerxes. Whatever the heck that means, right? They could have just left that out. I know what it means, but as far as mere mortals are concerned, who cares about that stuff? Element type system info must be followed by either attribute specifications or close bracket or whack close bracket, / close bracket, right? That's a pretty obscure message for saying, hey, buddy, you forgot to put this little end bracket in there, right? That's really what's going on. And when I put that end bracket in there, notice the wavy lines go away. So don't get too blown away by the weird error messages that Oxygen gives you. Focus instead on the usual things that could go wrong and finding the problem area and then correcting it based on things you well know should be there, like an ending bracket. One more thing to point out, and this is a very nice feature of Oxygen, is that it gives you a whole listing of all your problems along the way. And so this little red thing, so suppose I'm down here somewhere way down in the file, and I realize all of a sudden, oh, look, I look on my scroll bar here and I have a problem. Double click on that guy and I'll go right back to the problem. So it takes me to the problem. So very nice feature of being able to figure out where those problems are and being able to see if there was 5 or 6, if there were 5 or 6 lines down here that I had 5 or 6 problems, I can click on each of those lines and go back and fix them. Okay, so that's one thing that'll happen. Suppose I forget a quote mark here, another usual thing. Forgot a quote there. Again, I get the little error indicator, not exactly in the right place. I wish that it was in the place where the quote was missing. But I do get an indicator that something's wrong. Again, I get sort of a kind of a cryptic error message, but I look at it and I realize, oh, gee, I should have just put in a quote mark there. Okay? So those are a couple of simple things. Let me see what other ones I want to make sure. Broken nesting. So let me show you a nest here. I have something called short description. See that right here? I have the short description, open short description, close short description. Inside the short description are 2 paragraphs. Notice short description opens. I open and close all the children, then I close short description, right? That's correct nesting, where I don't close. It's exactly like parentheses, right? You always have to match your opens and closes, your open and closing tags, just like you match parentheses. Now, what happens if I break that? Suppose I take this para, and instead of where it belongs, I put it way down at the bottom of short description. Now, again, I get an error message, and let's see if it has any sort of... No, it's also cryptic. I've seen these error messages a million times, so I know how to interpret them, but if you haven't, you won't likely see this. But you should be able to track it down by seeing that this paragraph isn't closed. Okay, so not as good as I'd like it to be. In fact, that's probably my main complaint with XML IDEs is that they still leave you on your own a lot of the time to figure out what went wrong. They'll tell you very clearly where there's a problem, but it's sometimes very difficult for you to interpret what they're telling you the problem is. But it's always going to be those simple things. Spelled something wrong, forgot to close something, forgot to quote something, broke my nesting, right? Those are the things that are problems over and over and over again. So know to look for those simple problems. Okay, let's see. A couple of more things to point out. Tags have a scope. They have what's inside them. Oh, and actually, this is a good way to figure out broken nesting as well. So notice on line 9 here, I not only have this little open and close widget, I also have a little bracket. And I'm pointing to the bracket with my mouse here. That bracket brackets everything that's inside that particular tag. And so if I go to photo base here, the very first tag, notice my bracket is going to go way down to the bottom because everything is contained in photo base. If I go to system information, on the other hand, it's a very small bracket because only one thing is included in system information. Now, if I break the nesting like I did before, take this paragraph and drag it to the wrong place, I should also I've broken the nesting on that paragraph. So this one doesn't know how it nests. It doesn't know what its scope is because its scope is broken. This one, on the other hand, see my little bracket here? And this one is okay, but it's this one that's broken and the little bracket fails to show up. Now that's pretty subtle. I don't know that you're going to be able to necessarily always use that, but it's about as good as you got there. Okay, so I think I showed you pretty much everything I need to about debugging your instance till it gets to the point of being well-formed. And again, well-formed is the simple concept that it obeys all the basic syntactical rules of XML, and those rules are pretty simple, and you should really know them already. Okay, so let me review. I gave you the idea that tags that opens got to close. All attributes have to be quoted. Oh, one I didn't show you is the reserved characters. There are 2 major reserved characters that you need to look out for: open bracket and ampersand. A reserved character means a character that XML uses for its own purposes, and if you try to just type it into a sentence, it's going to think you're making a tag, for example. So you can't use these, and it's worth actually going back over to here to show you this. So I go in here and I type an open bracket. Look what happens. Oxygen actually thinks I'm typing an enormous tag that has all this stuff in it because that's kind of what it looks like. I type in an open bracket, right? But sometimes I need to say something like A is less than B, right? So I need to use that. And when I do, I have a special way of doing that. I start with the ampersand character, and now it drops down to show me all of the allowed variations on that ampersand. This is exactly like HTML, except the names for these things are different. In HTML, we have the, actually this is not different than HTML. This is exactly the way I would do the same thing in HTML, but I have other ones in XML that I don't have in XML. And the reason why this one, the ampersand, is bad, and notice now that when I put an ampersand in there with nothing left, with nothing else, it gives me this error message. And I think, yeah, it's also kind of another kind of cryptic error message. But when I have an ampersand inside my text, I need to also put in some of these extra characters after it in order to say that it's okay. because it's used here, right? When I have a special character like less than or greater than, I use the ampersand. So it's thinking that I'm about to create a special character here, which I'm not. I just want the ampersand in there. So I don't want the ampersand. I can hit Control Space, which is what I'm going to do now, Control Space. I get that same drop down, and notice there's a special one just for ampersands. Okay, so you may or may not be familiar with this kind of stuff from HTML, but you got to watch out for it. In HTML, it's a nuisance. In XML, it'll stop you dead in your tracks. Okay, so back over here. No open bracket or ampersand. No broken nests. I showed you that. If you follow all of these rules, these 4 rules that I have here, pretty much you're going to stay well formed. There's not very many other things that you could do wrong and be unwell formed, except for breaking, for example, breaking quotes. Okay, so I showed you the underlining that Oxygen did. I showed you how to look at the scope of the tag. That's over here in the brackets. I showed you how the locations come up in the scroll bar. That's over here. And I showed you earlier the idea of the indentation. You won't get this indentation ability if you don't have well-formed file. It turns green up here in this little area here if your file is well-formed. If it's not, this will be red, and you'll see the locations of the errors, and you won't be able to do that auto-indent thing. Okay, so the way to get good at this is not to listen to me talk about it, but to get your hands dirty, open an instance, mess around with it, break it in different ways and see what happens and see what error messages Oxygen gives you, and then go from there. Practice is what it takes. And one of the most frustrating things for my students is always getting to well-formed, because especially in a long XML file, it's not always clear. It's clear where the error is, but it's not always clear how to fix it. And so you need a little bit of practice there, and you need to get used to the things that, the indicators that Oxygen will give you. Okay, let's summarize on instances. Instances contain your base of information. That's what we're going to go through. That's how we're going to look at them from now on. They're the database. They're where we're going to draw information. So the premium in an instance is in staying organized and getting all your information well put together and well structured inside that instance. They're controlled by strict rules. That first level of strict rules is the well-formed level, which is just like HTML, and it's all about the things we've talked about, closing tags, etc. There's another level of rules that we'll talk about soon called schemas, and those schemas add the real power. So far, we don't have any rules that you didn't already have in HTML. Well, you'll see pretty soon that we have a whole raft of rules that you never had in HTML that you can have in XML. So these instances are controlled by 2 levels of strict rules, the well-formed level and then the valid level, that schema level that we'll talk about soon. They contain attributes and elements just like any other, just like you're familiar from in HTML. And we're going to do our instances in Oxygen. And as we go through the course, I'll give you a variety of demos using more and more of the functionality of Oxygen to get further and further along with building our site. So this week we haven't really started building our site at all. I've just got you oriented. I've given you some information to help you with our technology. But we're very soon going to get into the real job. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But let me pause here and see if there are questions coming in from either the forums or from our audience here.
Well, I have quite a few questions.
Okay, Beth has questions. Give me the best one first.
Okay, I think this is the best one. Can Oxygen check that well-formed XML is compatible with the schema?
Yes, entirely. And in fact, next week when we talk about schemas, that's exactly what we'll talk about. And you'll see that it gives you those same wavy lines, not only when you have syntax problems, but also when you have problems vis-a-vis the rules that are in the schema. So absolutely it can.
Okay. And a lot of people noticed that you're using the ID attribute in the sample XML that you were showing. And because people are familiar with HTML and CSS, they were wondering about how that might relate to IDs in HTML and CSS.
Yeah, nice question. I really like that. And let me give you my, my, again, not very politically correct answer, which is IDs are not very well utilized in HTML. And I give something an ID in HTML because I want a unique CSS rule to apply to it, basically. Or I'm transcending HTML and I'm starting to use JavaScript and I want to identify that element by an ID. That use of ID is very much closer to our use of ID. So I'm not putting IDs on these elements that you saw in my instance because I want to format them using CSS. I'm putting those IDs on my elements because I want to uniquely be able to locate them. And we'll talk a lot about locating those elements later on. It's a little ahead of where we are right now, but it's not a CSS usage at all. It's really the meaning of ID. ID means identifier. Uniquely give this element a name so that I can find it among all the other elements that are in the instance.
And Henry asked if we need to encode quotation marks, single or double or...
You don't need to you don't need to encode quotation marks if they're in the value of an element. If they're in the value of an attribute, you do need to encode them. So quotes are only reserved characters because they delimit the ends of the value of an attribute. So in the body of text, if you have a quote, you don't have to delimit it. You don't have to escape it.
Okay. All right. And then XML is sort of white space independent because we can split tags or elements over multiple lines.
Correct.
Is there any kind of end line character that we need to worry about?
No. Because you asked, I'll give you this. I'll give you kind of an overview of the idea of white space. And this is, and I'll context this by saying, if this goes beyond what you want to hear right now, just ignore it. So white space is ignored by XML and HTML, and line feeds count as white space. So what you see inside of the IDE is really for your eyes only. And right here is a line break character after the L of small in that sentence. There's a line break character, but it's not a line break as far as the XML environment is concerned at all. It's just another piece of white space that doesn't matter. So if we want to make sure that there's a break between this one and the next one, we're going to have to flag it with a tag. So I can do this, right? Now I've created two paras. Now I have a break. But it's not a break because I put in a line feed character. It's a break because they're in two separate elements. Now in HTML, you have a BR, right, break, which will force in the browser a break. We could do something like that if we wanted to embed breaks inside of paragraphs. Anything that we want to do, we can do. But what I want to give you the idea of is that if you do it manually, it doesn't count. And anytime, for example, let me go back here. So back to where I was. So I break that wherever I want. I break this wherever I want. Come on, break. So now I have something different, right? But I click this guy, and it all goes away. Except for this line break, and the line size here of this line break, you can set in the configuration of Oxygen so that the lines are whatever length you'd like them to be.
All right. And we had a few people who want to try downloading Oxygen to try it out for a month.
Okay.
Is now the best time to do that if they get a month free, or should they wait until later in the class?
Well, if you want to get your maximum month out of Oxygen, I guess I would probably wait till before the next class to get the maximum month out of it. Okay. However, that's not going to be enough either.
Yeah.
So unless you have some way of tricking your computer and getting multiple months out of it, I think 2.5 months is what it would take in order to get all the way through the class.
Yeah. Well, and there has been quite a bit of discussion about other editors and the Eclipse plugin.
Okay.
And
sure.
Such,
Yeah.
So
any other editor you want to use is fine. If you want to find an open source editor or something like that, or use one that's included with some other tool sets, you can sort of use Dreamweaver, but I wouldn't. And the thing I would say for sure, and you'll see this as we go further into the class, that for what we've done today, there's a lot of XML environments that would be perfectly fine. But starting next week, you're going to see that we have much more advanced functionality that we want out of our IDE environment. For example, and I'll just give you a very quick preview, we're going to look at something like this. This picture. And a text editor is not going to give you a picture like that, right? This is a very specific thing that it requires a pretty sophisticated XML environment to do. So just because it says it does XML doesn't mean it does enough XML that it's going to be sufficient for this class. We maybe have time for one more question.
Yes, one more question. Is there a version associated with XML, like HTML4, HTML5? Is there similar versioning for XML?
Yeah, there is, and it's one.
Okay.
There is an XML 2.0 out there somewhere, but it's never quite hit the hit the public. So our XML, and you'll see this is what somebody also asked about the prologue before. You'll see here on line 1 something that says XML version 1, and then encoding. Way beyond what I want to deal with you in this class, but there is an XML 2.0 out there somewhere, but it's never really hit the streets.
All right.
Okay, so what I'd like to do now to prepare you for next week is give you an idea of where we're going, and then review or overview with you the homework that I've created for you to do between this week and next week's class.